I'm the incoming chair. And joining us also are James Whiting, who is the chair of the Teacher-Educator intersection, and Polina Vinogradova, who is the, wait, I'm the chair, I'm incoming chair.
So Polina's chair-elect.
Chair-elect. Okay, thank you. I'm chair-elect. I was like, there's a chain of command there somewhere. Anyway, welcome everyone. It's great to see you all here. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. I also want to ask you before we start this webinar to save the date for our next webinar, which is Friday, January 13th at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Doctors Polina Vinogradova, who is here, and Joan Kang Shin will be talking about their recent book, Contemporary Foundations for Teaching English as an Additional Language. I now have the great honor of introducing our guest speaker for this webinar, the Pragmatics of Correcting Language Students, and that is Dr. Hilal Ergul. Hilal is an assistant professor of applied linguistics and TESOL at the University of Northern Iowa. Her teaching experience includes linguistics and TESOL classes at the undergraduate and graduate levels, as well as EFL and ESL classes in Europe and the United States. And her main research interests include second language acquisition, specifically language teachers' error correction practices and their effectiveness for learners, and pragmatics focusing mainly on politeness and humor. In this talk, Dr. Ergul will discuss language teachers' oral corrective feedback practices and the intricate pragmatic phenomena involved in the process. And we will have time for questions, Q&A after Dr. Ergul is done speaking. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ergul for her talk on this fascinating subject.
Thank you so much, Heather. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see you here. It's after work. It feels like it's like deep nighttime with the recent change, and then the daylight time ending. What am I saying? Daylight savings time ending. Yes. So thank you for coming. As Dr. Linville said, it's the Pragmatics of Correcting Language Students that I'm talking about tonight. And so I'm going to, well, I don't want to assume knowledge on anyone's part because we all study different things in our research. So we start with the importance of oral corrective feedback, the pragmatic concepts related to OCF that I'm going to be presenting results to you about, and then my study methods, the data I've been working with so far, my findings so far, and then the future directions followed by my conclusions. So why study oral corrective feedback in language classrooms? And before answering that, we should really define, like when I say oral corrective feedback, which I'm going to keep saying OCF this, OCF that, what do I mean? So oral corrective feedback is teacher and peer responses to learners' erroneous second language production. Though I must say in my research, I focus only on teacher feedback, not peer feedback. But yeah, whenever they make a verbal error and the teacher tries to correct them, that's what I call OCF, or oral corrective feedback. And to be very brief, for my reason to study OCF, it's beneficial to L2 acquisition. Time and again, studies have shown that correcting language learners' errors actually works. So that's why it's something that we still research a lot. That's something we still discuss a lot. And we're trying to basically get to a fundamental understanding of what makes feedback work, OCF work, right? And we have looked at so many things so far, including like task type during which OCF is being offered, the types of feedback that's being offered, or the type of errors learners make, or people's beliefs about feedback, teachers and students alike. Like from the student perspectives, they found what they call fear-driven successes. They hate feedback so much that they excel at language. So like it's been researched a lot, and we keep coming to the finding that it works, but we keep missing why it works. So we keep studying it, and that's what I'm focusing on also. Now, the pragmatic concepts that my research encompasses that's related to oral corrective feedback start with the concept of face. You know, it's a linguistic term very much so, of course, but it's also made its way to, you know, mainstream language, like saving face even is really used in everyday language. So in terms of face, so our public image that we want for ourselves, right? OCF is actually a face-threatening act. If you think about it, when you correct a student's mistake, what you're telling them essentially is that they're wrong. And what can be more face-threatening than telling someone that they're wrong, right? So it's inherently a face-threatening act. And it's been found to be so in research also, especially in communication studies that you can see here. There's many more. I just picked some. And then whenever there's a face-threatening act happening, there's also reason to look for mitigation. So how people try to reduce the negative effects of that face-threatening act. So I also look at how language teachers try to mitigate the face-threatening act of correcting their language learners' errors. And of course, face and mitigation go hand in hand, especially the classical theories of politeness, pre-1990s, right? They go hand in hand with face and mitigation, and of course, you know, Grice's cooperative principle. But basically, from Lakoff's 1973 publication, be polite, don't impose, give options, make hearer feel good, be friendly. Now, I mean, when you interrupt someone and interrupt them or respond to them saying that they're wrong, that's like, that goes against being, I mean, that goes against not imposing on someone, right? So that's more to the effect of like, why is this a face-threatening act and why there's a need for mitigation. And also from Brown and Levinson's influential theory of politeness, linguistic theory of politeness, you know, they talk about positive face and they talk about negative face. In the case of positive face, which we can define as the desire to be well regarded or even admired, the teacher has to correct language errors, because letting language errors go may make them sound like what if there's a person in the audience that realizes that their classmate made a mistake, right? And the teacher let it pass. So then there may be a need for teachers to not let errors pass because they want to be well regarded as a teacher who knows the grammar of the target language that they're teaching. That's just, of course, one of the ways in which positive face would be impacted here. And then from the student's perspective, negative face is impacted a lot because it's the desire to be left alone and to act as one pleases. And when you're trying to talk and someone interrupts you or responds to you saying you're wrong, your negative face is threatened, right? So these will tie into the research that I do on this. So my main study, besides mitigation, looks at smiling during oral corrective feedback. So why smiling? Well, smiling can be a way to mitigate face-threatening acts. Other people have found smiling to be so. And then there is actually a distinction between felt smiles and social smiles, or fake and genuine smiles, we can say. And that's the reason I actually cite Ekman here. So there is this psychology tool to measure and classify facial actions. And it's called the facial action coding system. And in that facial action coding system, also known as FACS, you can actually differentiate whether someone is smiling politely or genuinely, right? So that's one of the main things that I look at. So felt smiles, genuine smiles, are likely to cause positive affect in the addressee. So that's one of the reasons why smiling can be a mitigation strategy. Even if the smile is unfelt, they're still considered social or polite smiles. So there's still a reason why the person is smiling, right? So it's for a social purpose. It can still count as mitigation. And teachers apparently use smiling to manage sensitive actions as well as miscommunication in the class already. So those kind of make my study relevant, like right there. That's like they brought it all the way to where I am right now. And of course, there is also the pragmatic concept of humor that manifests in oral corrective feedback provision a lot in my data. I mean, not a lot, but I see it. I see humor in the provision of oral corrective feedback by the teachers in my data. So I looked at that also. And humor is already a well-known form of mitigation, and it's an accepted, widely accepted immediacy behavior, teacher immediacy behavior, like something you do to build rapport with learners that reduces learner anxiety. And like I was saying, humor can also be used by teachers to weaken the FDA properties of oral corrective feedback. Lastly, the other pragmatic concept that I've looked at is frame shifting, which is where I make the claim that incidental focus on form is frame shifting, a form of frame shifting. So first off, what do I mean by incidental focus on form? Incidental focus on form is essentially oral corrective feedback, with the difference being you give the feedback in an otherwise meaning-focused exercise in the classroom. So you're not teaching grammar, you're not checking for grammar, but for some reason, in an otherwise communication-oriented task, you have to attend to an error. That's the incidental focus on form. And that was something interesting that came up in my data, because so far the data I've looked at, as you'll see here in a minute, is adult learners. And so I shouldn't get ahead of myself. Okay, I'm gonna hold that thought. So what I'm looking at is incidental focus on form. So teachers are talking to their students, talking, and all of a sudden they have to like get to teacher mode and correct the error, and then they get back to their peer interlocutor mode, basically. So, and the origins of incidental focus on form come all the way from Michael Long's interaction hypothesis, and where he talked about focus on forms versus focus on form, where this was more like the structure-based older methodologies that we were using. Well, not we, we're not old enough, but how they did it in the olden days versus post 1980s, when people started to understand the importance of communication and communicative competence, and then came noticing and comprehensible output and all of that. So Michael Long took this all into account, and he said, okay, the best way to teach then is going to be to provide learners with meaningful communication tasks in which you attend to errors as they come up. So incidental focus on form then overtly draws learners' attention to linguistic items as they arise spontaneously without prior planning in meaning-focused interaction. So I said I look at incidental focus on form as frame shifting, but what do I mean by that exactly? Where's the pragmatics in all of this? So frames are a Goffmanian, like Irving Goffman, concept, right? So he defines frames as primary schemata of interpretation through which people make sense of their behavior and determine their practices of involvement in activities. So right now I am in the frame of an invited talk, a webinar, right? So it would be very out of very unusual for me to start singing and dancing right now, because that's not what you expect from the frame of an academic talk, right? So Yes. And then further related to my research, for frame shifting, we look at contextualization cues, right? The work of Gompers, of course. So one of a cluster of indexical signs produced in the act of speaking that jointly index, that is, invoke a frame of interpretation for the rest of the linguistic content of the utterance. So this will come in handy when I'm trying to identify how the teacher was being the teacher, or sorry, rather how the teacher was being a buddy to the students, and then they had to switch to the teacher persona, the teaching frame, and then switch back. That's what this is going to be about. So as you saw, there's a whole bunch of things I'm looking at and a whole bunch of things that I need to identify to answer my research questions. First things first, I need to identify the OCF sequences, right? Where the mistakes are, where the corrections are, etc., and the incidental attention to form within that umbrella. So for that, I use Lister and Ranta's 1997 analytical framework for OCF sequences. I am also a certified fax coder, so that's how I'm able to identify smiles, especially genuine versus non-genuine smiles. For the identification of humor, I use the general theory of verbal humor, along with other contextualization cues. For the identification of linguistic mitigation, I use CAFE's typology. To actually annotate and transcribe the data, I use ELAN. And also, of course, as with any respect-worthy study, there's inter-rater reliability testing. Like whenever I say this is an OCF sequence, like 10% of the data goes to 3 other linguists that look at the data, and then I look at all of our ratings and see if they match, or do we really know what we're doing, right? And then for same with the SMILE codes for the fax, that they were, I mean, it's hard to find certified fax coders, so it could only go to one person. So it was 20% of the data that he was able to do for me. And it's good agreement that we have as inter-rater reliability. Okay, so the data that I've been working on so far is approximately 16 hours of student-teacher interaction at a private language school in Turkey. These are intensive English programs. I had 3 groups of adult learners taught by 7 different EFL teachers. And the students' competency level was intermediate, or B2 at the time of the data collection. So that's what I looked at. And so I said I use Lister and Ranta's analytical framework to identify OCF error correction sequences. So just so we know what I'm talking about when I say OCF, this is from their seminal paper from 1997 that they use. And obviously other classifications for teacher feedback have been offered and everything, like including implicit versus explicit, input providing versus output pushing, immediate versus delayed, preemptive, reactive, etc., etc. But I find that if you focus, I mean, it wouldn't involve delayed feedback. This is all immediate feedback, I should say, and reactive. But otherwise, like input providing, output pushing, implicit, explicit, etc. Having these categories is the easiest, because every other categorization can be applied to these, because this was the original study, right? If I tell people I had this many explicit correction, this many recasts, etc., they can then say, okay, these are going to go into explicit and these are going to go into implicit, etc., because there are some meta-studies, meta-analyses that actually had trouble, because people who categorize their OCF instances as implicit or explicit included different types of feedback in the implicit versus explicit category, which made, unless you have access to the data, it makes it impossible to drive a bigger conclusion from multiple studies, right? So I'm like, I'm just gonna stick with the original, and then if anyone wants to do anything with them, the information is more broken down and available for further analysis. Anyway, this was kind of a tangent because I don't actually go into feedback types in this talk at all. My apologies. So, but okay, going back to the OCF sequence, it starts with learner error. So we kind of, in these studies, we kind of ignore learner errors that don't get teacher feedback. They're just lost. So whenever a learner error happens, there is going to be either teacher feedback or the conversation is going to continue, which we call topic continuation. When there is feedback, the possibilities are that there is going to be learner uptake, which means the learners are going to respond to the teacher's feedback, or they will ignore it and it will be topic continuation. And then if there is learner uptake, then chances are, the options are, there's either going to be repair, which means they've corrected the error, or there's going to be need for more repair. So either they repeat the same mistake or they make a different mistake, et cetera, et cetera. And then after learner uptake, the options are still either topic continuation, or in the case of actual repair, the possibility of reinforcement from the teacher. So it all starts with learner errors and it all eventually goes to topic continuation. But right here is where I'm interested, what I'm interested in, okay? What does the teacher do during the teacher feedback turn that perhaps affects the outcome right here in the learner uptake? So it's a way to operationalize OCF effectiveness, because we keep saying like OCF is effective, it's beneficial and all that, but how do you measure? Okay, you gave them feedback and they learned better. You didn't give them feedback, they didn't learn as well. Like, how do you operationalize that? Lister and Ranta's way to operationalize that was to look at learner uptake, the immediate response, unless it's topic continuation, the immediate response to teacher feedback. So they look at the feedback and they look at whether there is repair or where there is still need for repair. If there is repair in the learner uptake, which we call successful uptake, then they say the feedback was successful, effective, okay? So, and there's some aspects of my study don't look at the effectiveness at all, just what's happening at this level. But where I'm talking about effectiveness, what I mean is the teachers provided the feedback and the learners had some successful uptake, okay? And I mentioned ELAN, video annotation and transcription tool. This is what it looks like. I happened to have 2 video recorders, 2 cameras, right? So I was able to see the teacher and the board from the right corner of the classroom and from the left corner of the classroom. The teacher's face is hidden because I was young and naive and I didn't ask for permission and informed consent to share their images. So that's why it's hidden here. But so in ELAN, you can actually synchronize voice and video, and then you can, right here, you can select a portion of the video and you can say, okay, in this portion of the video, the learner said this, and in this portion, the teacher said this, and then you can annotate what they said. So I wasn't interested in the categorizations of what the students said, besides them being errors. But for the teacher, I was looking at the feedback type, the mitigation type, the smiling, the feedback response, and whether there was topic continuation, which in this case there wasn't. And then this is a very nice way to visualize everything. Like if you look here, I can see all 100-something instances of feedback from this one teacher all in one window, and I can see the beginning time, the duration, and all that. So this multimodal annotation tool was really helpful in my research. Okay, so what have I found so far? In terms of smiling and mitigation, I won't bore you with the numbers or the definitions of the mitigators or anything, but just so you know, I had in total 417 instances of oral corrective feedback between the 7 teachers in the 16 hours. And in 394 instances, I could actually see their face, because you saw the setup. Sometimes they were just out of frame, so I didn't see them. But in the 394 instances where the face was visible, there was 840 linguistic mitigators, which means approximately 2 mitigators per OCF turn, and 22% occurred with smiles. So I further found that the co-occurrence of smiling with linguistic mitigators was actually statistically significant. This is actually a great p-value. And so what does this tell me? When I was first starting to hone in on smiling and feedback, people were telling me, like, how do you know they're just not being evil? Like, I guess the expectation was the teacher would go, haha, you're wrong. I don't know. I never thought I would find that, but some people were like, how do you know that they don't come with negative affect? So if they did come with aggression or negative affect, if it was Schadenfreude, then it wouldn't co-occur with mitigators, which is the, pillar of being polite and sociable, right? So, but this here is a very significant finding, that there's two mitigators per OCF turn. Like, it's, people really are aware that they're imposing on their learners and all that. And also, I would like to remind you that the data come from adult learners, right? So if you think about it, and where I collected this data during my PhD, I used to be a teacher at that same school. So I know exactly the circumstances of these teachers and learners. You go into the classroom and the people you're teaching are like a director of a factory, or a mother with 3 grown children, or someone who supervises 200 people at work. So they're like, besides the linguistic expertise that you have that they lack, there's really no difference. They're really people who you could be friends with outside of the classroom, right? So it makes correcting them all that much difficult. That's what initially got me interested in all of this. So, and as you can see, the teachers here are trying really hard to mitigate their intrusion. So, okay, significant co-occurrence with smiling and all that. Then another finding that I had that I wasn't even looking for, but I'm very happy about. So every OCF instance was mitigated verbally or non-verbally. If not in that turn, then in a following turn. Okay, so bearing that in mind, and the 840 instances of mitigation, linguistic mitigation, let's look at this. The 15 instances of OCF without linguistic mitigation, one of them was a truncated turn, which means the teacher was cut off by something. So we really don't know what she was going to say, right? So it may well have had mitigation. We just have no way of knowing because she got cut off. And then one OCF turn that doesn't have any linguistic mitigation, the teacher actually turns to the student after correcting him and says, I'm sorry, like literally apologizes for him being wrong or for correcting him, right? I didn't have stimulated recall data or anything, so I can't tell, but I do know, as you do, apologies are a big part of politeness, right? So that's what. And then out of the 15, 13 of the instances included smiles. So then that led me to conclude that smiling in conversation where there's error correction, smiling can be the sole mitigator, because there's so much mitigation otherwise, and they significantly co-occur with smiling. And then in some instances, smiling is the only mitigator. I mean, the only thing you find, then leads me to believe that it's a mitigator. And this was actually published in the Journal of Pragmatics. Here you can see in references in a bit. And then I also was interested in the genuineness of the smile. So does it make a difference if you go like this? I mean, they don't do that, but that would be a fake smile, just smiling with your mouth, right? That would be a social smile. Versus smiling with the when the smile touches your eyes, right? I was really interested to see, because I was a certified fax coder, right? So it was already on my radar how people smiled and what they did. So I was like, okay, let's see what happens with OCF. So whether you are smiling or not has no impact on whether your students are going to correct their mistakes. However, if you are, as a language teacher, correcting someone's errors, if you are smiling genuinely, then there is a significant correlation that there's going to be successful uptake. Uptake. So obviously correlation isn't causation, right? I can't make the claim that they are correcting the mistake because you're smiling genuinely, but all I can say is there is a correlation between genuine smiles and successful learner uptake. So I think what that shows is this is empirical evidence, the evidence that smiling should be a part of the OCF conversation in second language acquisition studies. And this was published in the Journal of Psycholinguistic Research. Okay, since then, I've been interested in the role of humor during oral corrective feedback because, I do humor anyway, and I had the data that I spent so much time on, and I knew that I had instances with humor, so I wanted to look at that also. And as a result, I found that humor is also possibly being used as a mitigating device. And humor, just like smiling, also co-occurs with linguistic mitigation. But an interesting finding that I had, again, that I wasn't expecting, but that's the beauty of research, that it seems like humor actually has a distracting effect on the flow of the conversation in terms of error correction. So what happens is, in my data at least, the teacher jokes around, let's say, as they correct the students, and then the students join in the laughter, and they continue with the joking and the play, and there's laughters galore everywhere, and then they've forgotten about what they were correcting initially. So that was really interesting. So I'm really looking forward to really seeing, like, can I find that quantifiably in the data or not? But the initial overview looks like if you're being humorous, they will love you, but you will actually forego the focus on accuracy, possibly. But more on that coming. And then for the incidental focus on form version, I found that the teachers in the data do indeed shift between their teacher and interlocutor frames as they focus on form in the adult intensive English program classrooms. And I talked about contextualization cues, remember, how they make that shift. And so these aren't like isolated, right? They're sometimes overlapping, but they could do the switch verbally, non-verbally, or paralinguistically. So I suppose paralinguistic could also count as non-verbal, but I mean more like phonetically, with their tone of voice and all that. And the shifts seem to exist on a spectrum of the level of intrusion on the surrounding conversation. So in the data I have, as they're switching from the peer interlocutor frame to the teacher frame, sometimes they do it just with a smile. Sometimes they do it just with stress on a syllable or a word, or sometimes they go on to full teacher mode, like turn around, start writing on the board and like really explain at length why the student was wrong, so much so that at the extreme end of the frame shift, the teacher was actually not, I don't want to say not able to, or did not prefer to go back to the peer interlocutor frame. She said it's break time. So I think she had moved too far from her peer interlocutor frame to go back to it, is my speculation on what I saw. So then that tells me that teachers of adult language learners, at least, because that's who I've worked with so far, they seem to have a choice between being a peer interlocutor and a teacher. And the focus on accuracy might outweigh the importance of friendly chatter, because I see that time and again where, you know, they may let one error slide, but when another student makes the same error, they're like, okay, we need to address this now. So to continue with my studies of oral corrective feedback in language classes, in collaboration with a colleague of mine, I have now collected data from French and Spanish in tech language classes in the US setting, because my data was in the Turkish EFL setting, if you'll remember. We've got about 13 hours. We have finished the transcriptions and translations, and the analyses are now in progress. And here I'm trying to expand the sample that I have, because what I found in the Turkish EFL setting maybe will not be present in the US French and Spanish setting. So we'll see. And then with another colleague, I'm also looking at the English pronunciation class that was recorded in Costa Rica. And this time we're focusing on the prosody of the teachers during OCF. And then I am also, even though I'm happy with oral corrective feedback, and written corrective feedback is scary to me, I have started the data collection progress with yet another colleague, where we're looking at the use of emojis during written corrective feedback to see how they impact student perceptions and learner output, and their attitudes towards using Spanish as a second or additional language in social media. So the conclusions I can draw today, we still need a long way to go to really understand the social and linguistic mechanisms underlying teacher feedback. There is more to feedback effectiveness that we currently know. And teacher educators, since this is the teacher education interest section, teacher educators should dedicate more time to discussions about OCF in all its linguistic as well as pragmatic intricacies. And practicing language teachers should be encouraged to do action research and contribute to our knowledge base from from the ground. They need to let us know what's happening in their classrooms, so we can move the field forward. My references are long. And there's my email. If you want to write it down, I'll give you a second.
Hilal, thank you so much. I am fascinated and also just shocked at all of these elements that I had never even considered relating to corrective feedback. Honestly, like, you've just broken this whole idea open for me, and my mind is going crazy, but I'm going to open it up to see if anybody else has questions. The expert is in the room, please. You can you can unmute and turn on your video if you'd like to ask a question, or you can certainly write it in the chat.
I'm also pretty fascinated. Thank you so much. I'm also fascinated by the amount of data that you went through, that you collected and that you went through, and looking at that multimodal coding, which was new to me, and it was pretty fascinating. So I can only imagine how much work has gone into this. As I was listening to you, I was also wondering, and you kind of started addressing this with your new research with Spanish and French, because I'm curious how this type of corrective feedback, or like the students' expectations that you also talked about, right? Kind of like the face-saving aspects, how that would also be affected by students and teachers' kind of cultural expectations of the role of collective feedback in a particular educational setting.
So that's actually a very good question, Paulina. It's really interesting. So far, though, the teachers and students that I'm looking at happen to be from the same culture. So in the Turkish setting, the teachers are Turkish and the learners are Turkish. And in the Spanish and French settings in the US, both the professors and the learners are all American. So they share the same culture, even though one party is doing the teaching. Essentially, they share a linguistic background and a cultural background. But that's interesting. I want to keep an eye out for that, because how does that work when you are not teaching from someone from your own culture? How does that change everything? Yeah.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Excuse me. Shelley Page says, she's commenting or observing on the importance of relationship and human connection in the Feedback Act, and says that is really interesting. And Beth Montag says, I'm fascinated by the idea that humor might be distracting from the purpose of OCF. You mentioned doing more research in that area. Do you have a timeline for that?
474917.
Oh yeah, I think that's just the passcode for the meeting. I think that was a typo there.
Yeah, no.
Or that's your timeline, right? 474,000 hours.
Yep, that's more like it. No, that's actually the paper I'm working on right now. So hopefully, and since I'm on the tenure track, it's going to be out soon, I hope. But that's what I'm doing right now.
Well, I have a question about teacher education, because you mentioned that at the very end. I was just curious if there was research out there about how this comes into teacher education programs, or if you know about where it sits in where it's situated in teacher education programs. Have you looked into that? Are you aware of how explicit this is in programs, etc.?
I have looked into the research on that, which is pretty much non-existent. So that is up for grabs for anyone interested. Or I'm going to do it myself. More work for me. That's fine.
So the research, there isn't a lot of research on how explicit this is in teacher education programs, or whether it even exists in teacher education.
Not that I could find. I mean, I'm a human. I may have missed things, but I don't know of any research on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting area, an interesting topic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Muted. I was thinking about the cross-cultural aspect of that. And as a researcher, I think it would be easier for me to do that type of coding, do that type of investigation with people who are from the same cultural background as me. But just this week, I've been working with middle schoolers, and I've been thinking so much about generational differences. I love that you brought in emojis, but I've also just been thinking about, well, I'm older now, so it seems like there's a great divide between me and a middle schooler in sort of, what the expectations are and how things are taken even. I don't know if that played a role in your research at all.
So far, the data I've looked at, people belong in the same generation, because the teachers weren't too old or too young, and the learners were adult learners. So, I think maybe it's like 25 to 40 or so. So it's not that much of a gap that I could see a generational divide. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be one. If we're looking at someone our age teaching middle schoolers, then what's that going to look like? Absolutely.
And also, I think the stereotype right now of the younger generation is they need so much positive feedback all the time. So all that smiling, I don't know, that's the stereotype, right?
There's a couple things in the chat.
Shelley says in the chat, when teaching in China, I found that students wanted direct feedback. Reflecting on myself in the classroom, I can't help but be polite and smile as I give feedback. I find that I'm concerned about being kind towards my student. And Shelley was also kind to me by giving me a little compliment in the chat. So Another comment, Zhangqi Zhang says, thank you, Hilal. A small technological question. How did you transcribe from the video footage? Any software or something? If you have a recommendation for that.
I used Elan, so I'll put it in the chat. Elan transcription and annotation software. So this allows for multimodal coding. If you have audio files, video files, you can put them all in one place and synchronize them and look at them all together. And it's free to download.
Oh, wow.
I know that's the important part, right?
My ears perked up.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Other questions or comments for our speaker?
Hi.
Hi, Nikki.
I was thinking about James's question about, how do we bring this into teacher education courses? And sometimes students do something like micro teaching demonstrations, but then they don't really have an audience. And you can't, even if they're teaching in front of a real group of students, you can't force a practice of different error correction techniques. I mean, that you have to wait till that error occurs before you can implement an error correction technique. So, I'm thinking how we might be able to tell our teacher education students about the effect of pragmatics and smiling and humor, but how do we help them to develop the skill of giving the correction, because it's hard enough to practice teaching skills when you're not actually in a classroom, but then and then I also teach online, so how can I provide my students with those practice opportunities?
So one thing I do, and I don't know if this would fly in the online setting. I'm so glad I'm back face to face. But one thing I do so one of the classes I teach is called English Grammar, Form and Function. And in that class, we talk about how to teach grammar to English language learners. So in that class, we talk about proficiency levels, like the Common European Framework and the ACTFL, divisions and all of that. And then when we cover each grammar item, like how to teach articles, how to teach if clauses, how to teach, I don't know, the present progressive tense, etc. After we cover each grammar item, a student has a grammar practice activity where they pretend to be the teacher. Like I literally take a seat myself and they pretend to be the teacher. To their classmates, I say, you are gonna behave like you are the proficiency level that your teacher says you are and the age level that your teacher says you are. And to the student that's doing the GPA, I say, you have to tell us at first, where are we? Are we in Iowa, K through 12 settings? Are we in Japan? Are we adults? How old are we? How much English do we know? What's our proficiency level? And I spent a lot of time explaining to them why it's not sabotaging their friend if they ask a question or make a mistake, how that would help them in the future. So this semester, especially, I'm seeing a lot of like good, honest mistakes. And then the student teachers are having to address the mistakes. It takes a lot of time and energy and instruction, but that's one way I found to kind of implement that in the pre-service stage.
I was also wondering, like Nikki, I was thinking about those various videos that are around, like, like the New Horizon ones or the ones from the Annenberg. They might have, aspects of them. I know they're all edited, but they might have aspects. I'm not familiar with all of them, but I'm familiar with some of them. They might have aspects where there's error correction going on, and you could, analyze, that little pragmatic piece within the error correction of those kinds of videos. I'm not sure if that's, because you really have to look at the teacher doing it and then talk about, I mean, that's one way you could do it, is looking at the error correction that's happening and what are the pragmatics that are being employed there.
Mm-hmm.
Or then talk about alternatives, for example.
Yeah. One thing we do is, so I teach advanced methods where they're doing their teaching practicum, and they record 2 teaching videos of themselves. And then they kind of analyze those. And we talk about the different ways of teacher talk and engagement and giving feedback. And Tom Farrell actually in his book goes very nicely, also structures that. And so they look at themselves and think, so what was my teacher talk? How did I give feedback? How did I do corrective feedback? And it's very interesting how they find themselves, you know, because they're nervous, of course, like they're talking over their students instead of really providing kind of corrective feedback, or they're correcting like every single error and just overwhelming themselves in the class. So they're able to kind of doing this reflection. And then I can see how from the first video to the second video, things actually really change because they become kind of course, more comfortable recording themselves when teaching, but also more mindful, and they start paying attention to these nuances. And some of them would actually write these nuances into their lesson plans. So they're kind of mentally preparing themselves to what are the ways to correct errors, or to, you know, do recasts or do kind of comprehension checks with the students.
Hmm.
All
There's a
right.
comment in the chat about this as well. Did you see that, Heather?
No, I just saw it. I realized you looked at teachers OCF, but do you think the same principles would hold for peer corrective feedback? I often have students who will correct each other in my adult.
So that from a research perspective, I have zero knowledge on that. However, from my experience, I would venture a guess that's no. That would be a different process, or a different, that would, I mean, who knows? I shouldn't speculate with that zero knowledge. That would be interesting to see if, I would imagine they would employ different strategies of mitigation and politeness, because they simply don't look like teachers when they correct each other, from my personal teaching experience. But that cannot mean that they do no mitigation, because that would be quite rude and unlikely. But it's interesting.
So I guess if there are other questions, people can always send them to Hillel directly. And obviously there's a lot of your research out there as well for us to look at. So to go further with the topic, Heather, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I would just say, thank you so much, Hillel, for joining us and sharing your research. We, really in this, in the teacher educator interest section, really want to hear from our colleagues who are doing research, especially younger scholars. So we really appreciate that. Yeah. And just to remind everyone, we do have our next TEIS webinar on Friday, January 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with Dr. Polina Vinogradova, who's here with us tonight, and Joan Kang Shin, talking about their recent book, Contemporary Foundations for Teaching English as an Additional Language. And also our webinars are recorded, so you can go and find them on YouTube and watch all of our past ones. So
and I'll send out an announcement when I get that from TESOL. I'll send out that link as well to the my TESOL list. Thank you very much, Hillel.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening.